Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a really big Supreme Court decision, one with huge economic implications. I mean, think about it. How much power should a president have to just start a trade war? Well, the court just gave us an answer, and believe me, it's a game changer. So the Supreme Court just delivered this landmark ruling, and what it does is strike down a key economic power that presidents have been using. This is a big deal. We're talking about a favorite tool in the presidential toolbox just gone. And this isn't some abstract economic theory either. It's a real check on presidential power. All right, so let's get into it. What exactly just happened? What did the court actually decide here? Because this really gets to the core of how presidential power works when it comes to trade. Okay, so the vote came in, and it was a pretty decisive 6-3. And what's really interesting here is that this wasn't your typical party line split. You had justices from both sides of the aisle, conservative and liberal, voting together. That sends a huge message, right? It's basically the court saying, hey, there are real limits to presidential power here, and it doesn't matter who's sitting in the Oval Office.
So you might be asking, okay, which tariffs are we even talking about? Well, this ruling specifically targets these tariffs that the Trump administration justified as being a response to a national emergency. They were imposed on all sorts of goods coming in from China, Mexico, and Canada. And get this isn't just a few bucks here and there. We're talking about tariffs that generated over half of all the tariff money the U.S. has collected recently. That's a huge amount.
Okay, so how did we even get here? What was the legal argument for these tariffs? And, why did the court have such a problem with it? It all boils down to the interpretation of one very specific law. And that law is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. You'll hear it called IEEPA. Now, this law was meant to give the president some extra muscle during a national emergency, but, and this is the core of the whole case, does that power include the ability to just create new taxes, new tariffs out of thin air? That's what the court had to figure out. This slide really lays out the central fight. On one side, you have the administration saying, hey, the power is implied in the law. We need it for this emergency. But on the other side, the Supreme Court basically said, not so fast. Their ruling was crystal clear. Tariffs are taxes, and the power to tax belongs to Congress. If Congress wants to give that power to the president, they have to spell it out. They have to grant it expressly, in writing. No reading between the lines. So let's dig a little deeper into the court's reasoning here. Why did they draw such a firm line in the sand? Well, when you boil it all down, this whole thing is about one of the core principles of American government, a check on power. And Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, put it really bluntly. He said, and I'm quoting here, had Congress intended to convey the distinct and extraordinary power to impose tariffs, it would have done so expressly. Basically, he's warning that if you let the administration's logic stand, you end up with unchecked presidential policymaking. It's a pretty powerful statement about the separation of powers. Okay, so the tariffs are illegal. Case closed, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, this ruling creates a whole new, massive problem. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar problem. What do you do with all the money that's already been collected? And this is where it starts to get, well, really messy. The court struck down the tariffs, but they were completely silent on the money. They didn't say a word about whether the government has to give back the billions it collected. So they solved one problem, the legal one, but may have just kicked off an even bigger financial one. So what happens next? Predictably, the floodgates have opened. You have over 1,000 companies, and we're talking big names here, like Costco, Toyota, Bumblebee Foods, Goodyear, all lining up to sue the government. Their argument is pretty simple. You took our money under an illegal tariff. We want it back now. And you don't have to take my word for how complicated this is going to be. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was actually in the dissent, even called it out. He wrote that this whole process of figuring out refunds is likely to be a, quote, mess. That's pretty telling, right? When a Supreme Court justice uses the word mess to describe the consequences of a ruling, you know it's going to be a wild ride. So you've got this landmark ruling, billions of dollars on the line, the word mess being thrown around by a Supreme Court justice. You'd expect the financial markets to totally freak out, right? But they didn't. In fact, the reaction was surprisingly calm. Just look at this. This chart shows the 10-year Treasury yield, which is a super important indicator for the economy. On the day of the ruling, it barely moved, a tiny 2 basis point increase. That's nothing. It tells you that investors either weren't surprised by this at all, or they just don't see it as a major economic earthquake. At least, Not yet. And it was the exact same story over in the stock market. The Dow, the S&P 500, the Nasdaq, a little up, a little down, but basically business as usual. It's almost like the markets just yawned. For now, it seems like Wall Street is treating this whole thing more like a political story than a big economic one. So, where does that leave us? The Supreme Court answered the legal question pretty definitively, but in doing so, they've created this giant, multi-billion-dollar question mark that's now hanging over the entire economy. It really makes you wonder, with billions in refunds now on the table, has the real economic mess only just begun?